The views expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of their organizations or of Oracle or its affiliates.
What role does AI play in national defense? How does leadership need to evolve with the use of AI in that scenario? Where should AI be applied and not in the context of command and control? Hi everyone, I'm here with Tony Reeves, partner for AI in Defense at Deloitte. We're going to be talking today about the use of AI in a defense context. Okay, Tony, great to have you on here. I don't know if you know this, we obviously met previously. You were the first person I had on the list to interview for this AI Changes Everything video series. And I'm not just saying that. And it's because I thought you had some really unique views about how AI could be used.
So no pressure then at that point.
No, we're going to keep this very, very light. So tell us a little bit about your role at Deloitte, what you do, if you could please. Give us some background.
The journey.
Sure. So I've been at Deloitte 6 years. We are traditionally seen as a tax and audit company, a professional services firm. And 6 years ago, we deliberately started thinking, what's the future going to look like? Especially in defense, around technology, and this idea that we have to be continuing what we've always done, helping clients fix difficult problems and challenges, but also be relevant in that future space. And that means actually understanding the technology, how it's applied, what it does. And so I spent the last 6 years in Deloitte trying to help us work out with defense, security, and justice, what does AI mean for that sector? How do we start to adopt AI responsibly, safely, and effectively? We need to be making sure that it does and lives up to its promises. Prior to that, I've spent time in Microsoft as a digital advisor. I've worked in the government. I've led major programs. And I spent 13 years in the army. And so I have this weird background of being an infantry officer, somebody who used to hide in hedges and carry heavy kit, as well as a techie geek. And I was always a geek at heart, coding in the early 1980s when I was a kid, and continue to do so.
Excellent. But I think that's what makes you quite unique. You know, you've been on both sides of the fence, as it were. Okay. So why don't we start with just talking about where does it make sense? Where is it appropriate to use AI in a command and control context within defense? And then perhaps where does it not?
Yeah. I think that's the heart of, I think, for the audience, I think most people are saying, what's defense doing with AI? And naturally there's a concern, there's a worry that whenever something is not visible, not clear, people fear the worst. And I think that, often and sadly on regular, as you know as well, panels, it'll always be, what about the Terminator robots that are going to come and kill us, of course? And it's like, well, yes, there is a risk, but yet actually defense is taking that extremely seriously as an organization. And so where we're increasingly seeing the use cases really falling into three pots. There's the war fighting, the battle space piece, where, of course, in Ukraine, we see this all the time, where drones, whether controlled or automated, on both sides are causing damage and destruction. But that's a fairly small use case, although it's, of course, going to grab the headlines. In the command space, there's many activities which we as civilians would just take for granted. The idea that plotting a route from A to B, going from London to Birmingham, we'd immediately go to an AI and a map system, say, what's the quickest route? And yet for defense, this is still relatively new in many cases because part of the attention's on the battle space as opposed to that command and control, how do we make things more efficient? But then, of course, the biggest area, like every organization, is in the office space. Right. And that's where I think everybody is looking and saying, here's how AI today is making a difference to how we work, what we do, and how we deliver the outcomes that we have to achieve.
Right. So there's sort of battle space, office space, command space. And right now you're saying a fair amount of it's happening in the office space and the command space. Okay. It's interesting because, as you rightly say, all the headlines immediately go to the battle space, but all the values and the impact is happening in the other two, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, yes, there is a lot of work in battle space, and we see many things in headlines because it's always going to grab the attention. Last week, Ukraine announced that they'd seized ground in Ukraine back off Russians using purely autonomous systems, no humans involved at all, apart from on the Russian side, and Russians surrendered to a small group of remote-controlled drones. So they is always going to be a headline-grabbing story because nobody's interested in, I've used this AI to help me write this email. It's not going to make the 9 o'clock news, is it?
Understood, yeah. Like you, I spend a lot of time talking to MOD and central government. And the impression I get is that there's a real willingness now to adopt AI and apply it to things like logistics and stuff like that. Who are you typically working with? Is it the generals? Is it the SROs? And what are you hearing from them in terms of how they want to use AI?
I think that's a really big question. There's going to be lots of different ways to answer that. Normally, my clients range from government ministers and departments who are probably trying to either implement a strategy or been told by their head of state that we must do more in AI, either to create jobs or to move things or just to become more efficient. The generals, of course, are increasingly starting to look at, well, what does it mean? Where should I go? And and certainly in the UK, we've had some very forward-thinking leaders. I mean, Tony Radakin kicked off the Nelson project a decade ago, which was like, I don't know how much AI is going to impact the military and the Royal Navy. But if we don't start thinking about it today, we'll never know the answer to that question. So let's start exploring. It might be we spend £1. It might be we spend more than the defence budget on AI. But if we don't explore, we're not going to know. And so I think that sort of, most generals now today are starting to feel we need to be moving faster out of the explore space and much more into the implement and adopt and the use space. And I think the other bit, the other group that we spend most of our time working with are the users, in a way that, AI is changing what we do. It's also changing how we do it. And traditional defense procurement of, in 20 years' time, I need to replace this battleship or this aircraft carrier or this tank, and so I need to define the requirements today, is changing. Because the users are saying, well, I need it faster, quicker today in the battle space. The technology is changing much quicker. And as a result, we have to spend more time listening to the people using the capability and the problems and the use cases they have than perhaps the people more removed from that immediate problem. And again, this is very similar to most civilian organizations adopting AI. We have to have the problem to fix. And that needs to be the person who has the problem helping us fix and understand that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is something we're seeing in banks and retailers, right? Start with the outcome, start with the user experience and work backwards from there. Just, can I talk a little bit about, the mindset required for AI? Because you're right, we see generals and ministers say we need to adopt this, we need to move faster. But does the mindset change, right? So a general that's been in position, in role for 30 years compared to one that's maybe 4 or 5 years into their tenure, is it a different mindset that's required today?
I think that mindset is far more important than toolset. And yet it's much easier to talk about the toolset. It's much easier to understand what a tank does. And, as a young officer, you're trained, this is what a tank does, this is how it works, this is how fast it can go, this is the type of hill it can go up. And so all of that is defined. It's known. It's like, it's certain. And so the tool set, and whether that's software tool set and, products that are helping make decisions, or it remains the physical hardware tool set of a drone or an unmanned vehicle, is also relatively easy to know. It's a comfort zone. Mindset and changing mindset. I think that, military have always been quite comfortable fighting the last war. And, the cliche of, the hardest thing harder than putting a new idea into a general's mind is getting the old idea out of it. And I think that ability to put stuff into people's minds and say, you need to think about the problem to resolve it, and then think about the tool set. People instinctively get when you explain it. When we have conversations like this, people go, oh, that's so obvious.
Yes.
And yet when you speak to somebody who has spent their entire career of 30 years doing the thing that isn't so obvious, it sometimes needs people like us to say, let's have a think. Let's talk about mindset. The other thing I'd add about mindset as well is that often if we start with a tool set, we'll look at what do we have today? And so we'll look at, I have a tank today. And tomorrow, I'm probably going to want another tank because I understand tanks. So the tool set thinking, that's sort of like, that known, that certain approach, suddenly encourages people to go, I know this. That's what makes me valuable. That's what makes me important. That's what makes me a general. And so I'm very comfortable just replacing like for like. The leaps of mindset is hard. And this is where we talk about use cases and the problem set. Once you have a tool set and you apply it to a problem set, and you speak to the user and say, what are you facing as the problem, the issue? What's the thing that is challenging you the most to achieve? That overlap suddenly allows you to say, actually, this tool set's useful. This tool set's obsolete. And that starts shifting people into the mindset problem. How do I learn more rather than being a know-it-all? How do I become a learn-it-all?
And this is something I think Deloitte in particular have done very, very well, right? This whole thing of, the theory of AI, it's very, very hard for someone to get their mind around it. But the minute you identify a problem and you develop that into a use case, and then you start building something using the tool in a meaningful way, it sort of comes to life, right? Are there any techniques that you're using that are working quite well, where you're helping people move along that sort of mindset journey towards going from theory to practical application of AI? Any best practices or techniques that you've seen that have worked well?
I think that one of the advantages that organizations like Deloitte have compared to, I'll say, pure technology companies, is that we have a long history and business in helping people change how they think. That transformation, that business change, that's like, here's a problem, let's think about it differently. What ideas have you got? And sometimes, being a consultant is a blessing and a curse, because the curse bit of it is like, you're going to tell me what time it is by looking at my watch. And that sort of, consulting approach has a certain, it's trickery, it's games. And yet, it's really effective. It's an effective way of getting people to say, let's think about this differently. Let's think about this in a different way. Let's start putting together all those ideas and prioritizing them. Then, and this is what the change has been over the last 6 years, is how do we start applying that technology mindset, that technology delivery, that way of working in a more agile, flexible, lean startup manner to that consulting business and also with our clients to fix our problems. And so I think that we had a natural advantage and we can merge those two. We've had to learn far more about delivering technology with hands-on to bring that capability in. I'm perhaps giving away our secrets here because people say, well, perhaps I can start learning some consultancy stuff. But I think very much, if you're talking to users, and especially users who aren't used to talking about their problems, are more used to a system where I've given it to the requirements manager, they're going to fix this for me. Yep. If you're talking to users, you need those techniques. You need those abilities to make them feel comfortable, to share ideas, to have open discussions, to realize that failure is going to happen, but that's okay. Yep. That reassurance that we're going to help them through the failure to learn, we're going to do that quite quick. So all those techniques, which we'd always have as an agile delivery team, that's what we've been trying to bring together with that consulting skills.
Understood, yeah. We've spoken a little bit about the human element, the mindset element. And one of the phrases we always use in sort of corporate AI is human in the loop, in the flow of work. Do you have a view onto when there should be a human in the loop for use of AI, or if there are situations where you absolutely want completely autonomous control when it comes to defense?
Couple of things on this. I think that the average general thinks they're as strategic as Eisenhower, as good looking as George Clooney, and as competent, as far better than anybody else that's in their command. And yet the average general is kind of average by definition. And so we end up trying to get the average general to think, well, there's things AI can do to enhance you, to make you better, can just support that decision. And we've had histories of this, not just in the last 10, 20 years, but if you go back to Second World War, people using science and data to make decisions like, do we invade Normandy this day or do we delay it? Those difficult, hard decisions, scientifically based. All that AI is doing is presenting that science in a faster, quicker way in many cases. And so I think part of the challenge with people is to try and get them into a point of saying, I can use AI to enhance what I do. Once we get into that space, then it's a question of what do I not want to use AI for? When we talk about the battle space area, people quite rightly get worried that without human control, we're going to have a similar problem to the mine issue that we've had in places in Croatia and Bosnia. Croatia last month declared that finally, 25 years after the conflict was resolved, 30 years after the conflict was resolved, they're now mine-free as a nation. And you're thinking, for 30 years, they've been living with the consequences of uncontrolled munitions. So people are quite rightly worried about AI without humans
Yes.
causing unknown issues and problems. And so we certainly need to have humans with control over AI and consciously thinking, how do I use it? But the debate we often get into is then, do we have humans in the loop? And now the average normal military officer will say, of course we do. And the ethical AI technologist will say, of course we do. We must always have humans in the loop. And yet, the concern is this. If an adversary is using AI to move faster, to think quicker, to create damage to our soldiers, to kill them more efficiently, effectively, and more rapidly, then will we as a society be comfortable that we are maintaining humans in the loop at the cost of human life? Now, we could argue that this is one reason why we need international regulation around the use of automated and autonomous systems in the battle space, and we certainly should discuss that. But at the same time, we need to recognize that we need human control, but it does not necessarily mean that humans need to be in the loop. I'd say that in the next couple of years, we're increasingly going to see autonomous systems acting without humans, but controlled by humans on what their targeting is, on what they do, and with controls to deactivate those devices once their mission has either succeeded or failed. That's where I think we're going to.
And it's exactly the same, as you say, in the office space, right? There are, in the same way that I have conversations with banks and governments and retailers every day as to where you want to give agency to the agents and allow them to have full autonomy, you will have those exact same scenarios in defense, right?
I think just to continue that, back in 2017, I was one of the people who signed the Future of Life paper to say that we need to have better control over lethal autonomous systems. And I maintain that view. We need to have better control over lethal autonomous systems. And I often say, I don't think that is putting humans in the loop to do that control, because we'll end up with a worse problem than one we're trying to solve. But things I think we do need to discuss is, when in 2007, Estonia was attacked and hacked, we had the Tallinn Manual that got published afterwards. And the Tallinn Manual is guidance for military commanders by lawyers as to what is within the law of armed conflict for the use of cyber warfare. That manual gives very clear direction, which military commanders can understand, which says, if I use cyber warfare to do this, if I destroy hospital systems, that is probably going to be a war crime with serious consequences as a result. That guidance is essential for the conduct of any type of cyber attack or defense. Yet we don't have that similar option, that similar manual, that similar guidance for the use of AI in a battle space. And I think we're increasingly seeing AI that can do significant damage and significant harm, and we are leaving it to the commanders in the field to make those decisions about law of armed conflict, which they are trained in, and they get regular updates on as to what is legal and not.
Yep.
But the application is hard. So that's why I say we don't need a human in the loop. It's why we need to be debating what are we comfortable with.
It's an important debate, and we must always consider the human element, particularly for the commanders in the field. Just shifting a little bit, you've spoken in the past about that mix of algorithms, compute, data, energy. What are you seeing? Are they getting better at using compute, using the data? Energy is obviously something that's being discussed now. That mix of those four elements. Are there any that we're doing better at or worse at? What's your view?
Yeah. My first defense AI job was 1999 during the first bubble, and it was like discovering a new world. It was just like, we can do all these things. It's amazing. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be incredible. It wasn't, and it was really dangerous, and it's really bad, and it's just like, really? It doesn't work? Oh no. But where that drive came from was compute and algorithm. The algorithms which had been built and developed over many years, suddenly with the arrival of the internet, we started thinking, we've got compute now. We can now start doing it. We've got really high-grade compute capability. Surely, if we throw enough compute at a problem with a really clever algorithm, we can infer confident and right decisions. We couldn't. We didn't. It wasn't a great answer. Today, I think that with the internet embedded into our lives, that gives the data aspect. That gives us the access to understanding, which has obviously created large language models and GPTs, and we ended up in this whole world today where people have AI, multiple AIs on their phone. That's all because the data has been understood, exploited, and used to help create artificial intelligence. Data is the real shift, isn't it? Data is that being able to understand, to comprehend, to place your more sensitive data in a field of wider understood data and then say, what are the differences? What is happening? And whether that's healthcare and saying, here are my patients' data. How do I share that in a trusted environment to see, do I have patients with a case that I can help cure quicker? Or whether that's defense. Data is at the heart of where AI is. The last one, as you mentioned, is suddenly energy.
Yes.
And I think that for military adoption, we're still starting to work out that all this compute, all this data, all this algorithmic driven decision making costs energy. And the one thing that defense is good and bad at is energy. I mean, on the bad side, we have fast jets that burn thousands of gallons of fuel in a minute. So we have high capacity energy, and you're really bad at making that efficient and effective. Nobody's talking much about the energy management for algorithmic use in defense. They're talking about, do I have access to some energy? And energy will always be there. So I think data and energy are the two real big topics which will be
It's interesting. I hadn't considered the energy part. Obviously there's a race for energy when it comes to AI, and we're looking at alternative approaches. But this whole drive of efficiency, it takes on a whole new meaning when you're away from central HQ or the centralized cloud data center. So just using that same amount of energy much more efficiently is something I hadn't considered.
One of the things that one of my old programs was fitting command and control systems onto military vehicles and replacing tactical command and control. And one of the debates we saw getting into was, on one side, every vehicle becomes a node for artificial intelligence. This was back in 2015. So it's every vehicle is a node for artificial intelligence. And a decade ago, everybody's saying, what nonsense is this? It's decades away, artificial intelligence. But the biggest hurdle was the power supply within the turret, and trying to say, well, actually, if I want to have a faster compute capability, I need more power. That power is coming off either the engine running, which creates thermal signature, or the batteries running, which drains the batteries. And I probably need that for other things like life support and surveillance and turret control and weapon systems and stuff. And so in parts, we're quite good at energy management. But scaling it and constantly thinking about it and saying, I need to upgrade this capability with an edge compute that will suddenly provide the comms network for a bigger compute back there, higher bandwidth going backwards and forwards, plus the energy management. That's a debate still behind in defense.
Yeah. I'm actually seeing the same thing playing out actually in police forces, right?
Yes.
How do you create almost this private mesh network where it's completely distributed and highly resilient? Just going back to data, one of the things I think now has changed is, if we were having this conversation maybe 5 years ago, it would all be about big data.
Yeah.
Take all your data, put it in one place, prepare it, unify it, off you go. Now, I think we're becoming much more selective around which data we use, but also we've learnt this new trick of bringing the algorithm to the data, not the data to the algorithm, which I think has just opened up so many more scenarios for how we use that. Are you seeing something similar as well?
Certainly on that big data, we need a data lake. We need to put everything into one big puddle. And there's often a puddle, I suppose.
Puddle, I love that.
One big puddle, and say, that's all my data. And you're entirely right in that's the ability to, can we put the algorithm and the compute where the data is, and then save bandwidth, especially for military purposes, because bandwidth is the hardest thing to command on the battle space, whether it's either being denied by the enemy or we just don't have enough of it. There's no organization apart from the US military that has relatively unlimited data bandwidth, and even they have very limited relatively. So I think that's that requirement to start putting capability forward. And whether that's NPU chips or whether that's going to be GPU chips pushed forward, that's something that's a really exciting possibility. Yeah. But increasingly, we're not seeing that sort of necessarily that thinking in many parts of defense. The other thing as well, of course, is creating small and medium scale language models. Yes. Highly bespoke, trusted, safe capability that does limited solutions or use cases, but therefore run on lighter compute, lower energy, smaller amounts of data as a result. I think we're starting to see a shift in the large AI providers and more bespoke solutions. You could argue that they're starting to differentiate about we do this, we do coding better, we do imagery better, we do understanding or language better. But nobody's really shifting. Perhaps Mistral maybe is starting to shift into that deployed edge, bespoke compute capability.
Yeah, I agree. I think definitely starting to see the early signs of, highly optimized, specific, small, medium language models that solve one or two tasks incredibly well. And the footprint is much, much lower, right? The ability that you could deploy it potentially on a small device.
And on that as well, you have that high degree of assurance as well.
Yes.
Because now you have an algorithm which is doing one or two things. And therefore, the training and the understanding and the knowledge to be able to use that safely is easier and simpler.
Yeah.
It's going to identify this. It's going to say yes or no to that. It's going to tell you this sort of information. If it's telling you anything else, it's not working.
And
Don't
in terms of
it.
cost, efficiency, but also security, it's a lot easier to lock these things down.
100%.
Right? Yeah.
And we're working with MOD as their assurance partner for AI. And that's very much what we're trying to get into, is to saying, look, if you work out what that, same as secure by design, we're talking about trustworthy by design. Start early, start thinking about what the use case is, start thinking about what the data is, start thinking what the user's going to do. That's a much easier thing to accredit and assure and to trust than if we're trying to say, well, it could do this and it could do that, and I might get this bit of information. Simplified problem sets allow us to start saying, okay, that is a simplified tool set to govern and control.
That's interesting, because that's another thing that I'm a big believer in. As I said, 5 years ago, we'd be talking about big data, but also 5 years ago, we'd be talking about solving the entire problem before we get moving. But now this ability to break it down and simplify it, get going, and then iteratively build as we go. I'm seeing that a lot in sort of the enterprise space. Is that something that you're seeing in defense, where we're breaking the problem down into smaller chunks and simplifying?
100%. But
you are. Okay.
But I imagine you're also seeing that chief finance officers are less comfortable with that, because from an enterprise scheme, they want to say, I want X amount return on investment, and I'm going to introduce the AI to do that return on investment. In the same way as back in the 90s, probably the migration to we're both old enough to remember Microsoft Office 95 coming out and stuff. Office was seen as, this is going to fix this problem. This is going to do that. And we all did the same thing in the same way. If we send an email, subject to type the email, press send, it goes. It's it. And the training is very simple. The return on investment is, I now don't have to post stuff using stamps, saving. I can now send millions of emails every day, less of a saving. But but that's like, that shift is quite easy for economic chief finance officers to calculate. Once we start decomposing almost individual use cases, this soldier is going to use AI for that. This officer is going to use it for that. This person's going to use AI for that. Suddenly the return on investment becomes very individualistic, rather than enterprise.
And you can quantify it much easier, right?
Well, you can, but yet when you aggregate that up, it's much harder, because it's not a simple calculation. So we did some work with the Ministry of Defence, where we were looking at adoption of AI. One of the feedbacks we had was that for people who are neurodiverse, it was a far higher net satisfaction score that came out, because they suddenly found they didn't have to get stuck in the process, which they struggled with. They could use AI to guide them through and answer the process. So that return was significant for that percentage of the workforce, which was quite large, who struggled with process. I'm one of those people who really struggles with process. And so, having AI do it for me, godsend. But what we end up with is, when we try to aggregate that up, the question is, well, how many minutes did we save per person? Or that stuff, that's like enterprise way of thinking about return on investment, is being challenged by AI. Very, very hard, because we're having to almost create an individual return on investment and somehow aggregate those up. I'd save many hours by not attending meetings where I'm not needed, but seeing the summary of it and then getting that understood to me. Does everybody have that use case? No. And so we can't just blanket out, same way as we did with email, that everybody will use email. On average, X people send X amount of messages per day. The return in savings is this.
That's interesting. Yeah, because it's almost like, I think it's Jevons paradox, right? If you free up 15% of someone's time, doesn't mean we all get to go home 15% earlier, right? Actually, the research shows they actually end up working more because they have more time to invest. Are you seeing a level of scrutiny from the finance teams around the initial investment in AI pilots and then the return on investment in the same way that we're starting to see now? Because we all know the figures, right? 80% of AI pilots failed I think that's changing now. But are you seeing similar levels of scrutiny in the
I think
defense?
it's there's scrutiny in commercial engagement. And one of the big things I've seen, certainly in the United Kingdom, started to shift in some parts of NATO, is that the commercial teams are changing how they contract for digital capabilities, not just AI, but digital capabilities as a whole. And so they're increasingly starting to, to be interested at the start of the idea. And when, traditionally, security accreditors had this same issue, is that they get called in at the end. We've built this, we're going to do this, now come and accredit it. And commercial teams often were doing exactly the same. We decided we're going to buy this, go and buy it for us. And so the commercial teams really struggle with that. So what we ended up with is commercial teams now, again, very engaged early on to say, what are you trying to do? How are you trying to do it? What time scales are you trying to do it in? And so they are able to say, here's the best way to buy that capability. And we've seen some really significant changes over the last 4 or 5 years with the mindset of the commercial team who are curious and want to know what's going on. First time I had a commercial officer turn up in a meeting with a client just because they wanted to know what was happening, as opposed to something gone wrong. That was a shock. But actually, that's exactly what I'm seeing regularly now with commercial team. And the same with that accreditation team, the security, the assurance piece, so much easier. You start with that. You work through the process. You provide evidence as you go that it's working there. The use case different. Well, this is what the consequence is. And then the assurance team can then say, okay, we understood that. We anticipated that, or we didn't anticipate that, but we understand where it's going. So I think there's a real shift on that.
Yeah, and I'm seeing the same thing, commercial teams, finance teams, but also HR suddenly turning up, sitting in the back of these meetings and starting to participate. I think it's a sign of maturity. I welcome it, actually, because I think it's really good, because just keeping this in the labs or in the tech teams, it isn't going to scale, right? We have to get this out into the other lines of business.
Oh, yeah, I think I 100% agree. And I think that any organization that's deploying AI through their CIO is probably seeing that 80% failure rate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where we have diverse, multi-skilled teams coming together to say, I've got this problem, I think AI can help us. And then the tech team are helping them deliver it. The HR team is saying, okay, how do we deal with this? Where does it go? The commercial team is saying, what's the best way of not just contracting it for day one, but supporting it and refreshing it? And how often do we need to change the model, the support, the package? Perhaps you need to do a whole new project in a year's time. You need to bring all those two people together. Those intelligent organizations are the ones
to me
is
the most fundamental shift that we're seeing, right? That's the key to success.
And it's ironic that AI can help them do that.
Yes, it can.
If they get this right, it becomes self-reinforcing.
So one of the things I have to ask you, the phrase that's on everyone's lips, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, is sovereign AI, okay? Trust. I'm certain that this must be something that comes up almost every day when you work with your clients. It certainly is for me. What's your view on sovereign AI? What are you hearing from defense?
I think that the current situation globally, where we have an increase in conflict, we've had a long period, especially in the West, of a decrease in conflict and a more stable and peaceful society. The whole peace dividend post-Cold War has led society to think, well, we're in a period of peace and we'll always be in a period of peace. And that, I think, is a flawed assumption. It assumes that everybody is interested in maintaining the current status quo. And we're seeing many world leaders who are either deliberately or accidentally disturbing that status quo. And so we end up with, first of all, this increased conflict and uncertainty. We've also seen a rise where national interest has suddenly become more important. Not the most important. We still see a huge amount of global cooperation and collaboration. But national interest become more important. Going with national interest is this: where do I go with my data, my AI, my technology? And if you start looking into AI as a fundamental driver of growth in a society, then owning, being responsible, being able to trust it, being able to just declare it as, I have confidence that won't be switched off by an adversary or by a competitor, or somebody else will outbid me, and then suddenly as a national organization, national state, I'm not providing that critical capability. That's obviously on every political leader and senior military officer's mind. It's like, can I trust the access and availability of that system, not just the nationality and the origination of that system? And so we're I think, seeing every NATO country starting to come together and saying, at what level do I need to have purely sovereign capability where everything from the energy supply to the data, to the compute, to the facilities, to the failover capability, to the management, to the build, all of that is entirely done by my single nation? How much of that can I collaborate and share with and trust allies to build? And how much of that can I generally say it gives me higher resilience, higher failover, higher assurance, higher trust by being able to suddenly say, well, actually, this energy system has been destroyed in my country, and therefore I need to switch over to this instead. I think it's a difficult debate. If you look at the start of Ukraine, in day one, their largest data center was destroyed. It has become critical national data as a critical national infrastructure. On day two, they started using data centers outside Ukraine to maintain capability and decision making. So I think that idea that sovereignty is really important. Sovereignty does not mean nationally everything is stored in a bit of tin next door in the office, and I can go and kick it occasionally and switch it back on and back off. It's a very difficult debate. I mean, something that we're spending a lot of time
It's interesting
discussing.
you say that, because a year ago we had this conversation around Oracle deploying data centers physically in the nation. But if you look at what's just happened in the Middle East, we now have a lot of clients saying, we want to take our applications and our data and physically deploy them outside. So it turns out actually to have sovereign capability requires you to work with a global provider. And one of the things, I don't know if you have a view on, is do you think it is even possible, when you look at the supply chains, all the technology that is provided, to be 100% sovereign in building a cloud data center or providing AI?
I believe that some nations in the world are achieving that goal. In China, for instance, where they're endeavoring to build not just their own operating system and internet, but also their own GPUs and capability to do it. And they are struggling. And if China is struggling with that capability, then many other nations will probably struggle as well. Going back to that use case example, I think there are use cases where there are things which a nation will probably want to say, I want capability to be guaranteed to provide this for my national survival, infrastructure, credibility. And that is stuff you could probably run on your own compute, provide the energy supply to do it, but it's going to cost. And I think that's the big challenge, which, if we talk about compute, algorithm, data, energy, the one that's hidden and seldom talked about is cost. Nations like that ability to be able to go and kick the bit of tin next door and make sure all their things are still green and it's all very good. They don't like the bill that comes with that, which says it's going to cost you X amount per year to maintain it. And one of the big decisions we're seeing at the moment around energy is energy cost as a driver for data location. Whether that's European nations suddenly realizing that it's much cheaper to use another nation's energy than their own energy, and therefore to say sovereign is important, but cost is also a factor, and therefore I'm going to not necessarily rely on purely that. But I think there are some use cases where you can put very bespoke critical systems into entire national stacks.
Yep.
But when 100%, no, I don't think
we're not quite there yet today.
You certainly wouldn't want to be there.
And you touched on sort of the competitive nature, potentially even at a national level. How are you seeing AI changing this nature of competition between nations or even between organizations?
How long have you got? So it's this is one of those things that I spend a lot of my time talking about. I think that today we are seeing AI warfare. There's loads of books written on AI warfare. Started writing one myself, but I'm lazy and therefore stopped after a while. But but the idea that we're seeing AI warfare today, we're seeing this concept that Ukraine is the future of warfare. I think it's flawed. I think it is a nature of warfare. It's evolved in the same way as the tank evolved from 1916 to 1939. We see this evolution of military capability to do what we do today, but a little bit faster, better, smarter. The true difference that's happening is when we see AI agentic warfare, which is starting to be built, where we have AI as a capability to fight different wars in different ways at different paces. So we don't have to fight a kinetic, physical battle space war. We are fighting a war against a nation and defeating that nation before the war even starts. This, this concept of the 7-minute war idea. Yep. I generally believe that shift many people don't realize is happening, but it places AI not as a tool that enhances current warfare, but AI as the tool of warfare. So that's the second shift. The second shift is this, like, AI is suddenly critical for my national survival. And you could possibly look at that in recent conflicts, where the initial phase of conflict hasn't just been the destruction of airborne systems and early warning systems and air defense. It's also been cyber attack using AI capabilities. And yet, the third phase, which I'm more worried about, is that if you're a nation where you are competing with a country where AI is the distinct advantage they have over you as a military nation, then you need to have a fight for AI dominance, and you're in a totally different level of warfare. So if a 7-minute war is this notion that a country could have superiority through AI, the worrying phase is when other countries start realizing we have to defeat that AI capability so we can survive or win. My master's degree was in revolutions and military affairs. This is a revolution that people are starting to see in the same way as aircraft carriers, tanks, trains, machine guns, horses and chariots change the nature of battle. We are seeing a revolution which is totally different from the wars that we fight today. And my last comment going back is getting those old ideas out of generals' heads is far harder than putting new ideas into them. We are still preparing to fight Ukraine as a type of conflict and seeing that as the future.
Definition dash.
Tony, I feel like I've made you work today, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a breather. We're going to do a quick fire round, if that's all right. We're going to time it. So I'm going to ask you 5 or 6 questions. I think we have 30 seconds to do this. Whatever comes into your mind, just go ahead and say it, okay? Okay, so let's start. One word for AI today.
Nervous.
Ooh. One word for AI in 5 years.
Controlling.
AI agents, hype or real shift?
Real shift.
Okay. Biggest risk in AI right now?
Leadership understanding and lack of it.
Good. Biggest opportunity for AI right now?
Leadership understanding and lack of it.
Excellent. One thing leaders consistently get wrong?
I can't say the third answer at the same time.
I've started, so I'll finish.
But for time, I'll say exactly that. I think that they fear that leadership, understanding AI, is all about them, not the next generation.
Excellent. Okay. And one AI term that you would wish people would stop using?
This year, agentic.
Agentic.
I think everybody's going to say that. And I think the other one is Gen AI as a generic. It's an AI thing, Gen AI.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So, Tony, one of the things that you've spoken quite eloquently on is leadership when it comes to AI. Are there any traits or characteristics that, as leaders in defense, we need when it comes to the use of AI?
Yeah, I'm a product of Sandhurst, and Sandhurst is very much around traditional leadership values applied to modern challenging situations. But ultimately, Sandhurst would always teach, General Slim's concept that leadership is just plain you. And it's about understanding yourself, understanding your people, understanding who you're working with, and then being able to lead in those environments. And yet AI is changing that. AI is suddenly, it's not just plain you. It's just plain you plus AI. And I think that leaders, especially military leaders, are struggling with that concept to say, I don't understand AI. I don't understand, I know what I want to do. I just don't know what the tool set helps me do or how to do it or what to do with it. And so we end up with these leaders, not just military, but leaders as a whole, who are very conscious, very worried, and think that the leadership about AI is all about themselves and their command and the situation they're in today. And yet we're seeing AI changing so rapidly, capabilities that are taking 6 months to evolve from concept to effective capability. And so if leadership is concentrated purely on today and themselves and their issue, they're missing the really big challenge of AI. And that really big challenge is about the next generation of leaders. We are seeing leaders today struggle, but they got to their position pretty much by doing, when I was in the army, it was one day, son, and it was son because I was infantry. One day, son, all this will be yours, just do what I did. That's changing. We know that's changing because the leaders are speaking to us and saying, I don't know how to lead in this new environment. What about the next generation? And so really the role of leaders today, military or anywhere, isn't deal with the situation today. It's curate that journey for the next generation of leaders, because their journey is going to be so totally different. They're going to be playing with AI from day one. They are going to be using AI in ways that we didn't consider or conceive. And more importantly, it's going to be embedded into what they do. And we'll be using AI to do all the easy stuff. The things that you and I learned and failed at, and then, that I wouldn't do again, they're going to be automated. And so our next generation leaders are not going to have these learning experiences. They're not going to have leaders who are necessarily helping them through that, because it's all new to them as well. So the real challenge for AI and leadership, curate the journey for the next generation.
Curate, yeah. Do you think that this next generation has almost like an inherent advantage? I mean, the other day, my son came to me and showed me on his iPad that he'd built an e-commerce website on Shopify and he's now selling stuff, right? And he just did that in a couple of hours. It just becomes, it's inherent to him, right? It's intrinsic. Are you seeing that this new generation of leaders that are coming through in defense kind of come pre-equipped with those skills, or is there still a lot?
I think that we often use shorthand about natives, digital nomads, and people like that who they've got this advantage because they were brought up with it. We coded as kids, we played with computers as kids, we understand how computers worked, and people would say, oh, well, it's easy for you because you grew up with it. I've had to learn all this from scratch. And that concept that anything, once you hit 40, any technology is magic as opposed to technology, I think is nonsense. I know 70-year-olds who quite happily using code with AI to build exactly the same situation, the same thing. It's like, I can do this and with AI. I didn't know how to code before, now I can do this. And I also know 17-year-olds who have got no interest in AI computers and stuff like that whatsoever. And so to say it's a generational thing is easy, but I think flawed. I think it's that curiosity thing, and it goes back to that mindset. How do we create and encourage curiosity regardless of your age? I was speaking to a pilot from the US Air Force, retired. He flew in Vietnam, and he was talking about how he is using AI to help him in his job now. He still acts as a special advisor. There's somebody you'd look at and go, US Marine Corps pilot from Vietnam era, probably not the person you think is going to be using AI, and yet he was. So I think that we've got to start thinking that the current generation have an advantage. What can they do with it?
Yeah.
But it's not exclusive. We can all start using AI in those ways.
Yeah. And sort of thinking forward into the future now, I'm thinking potentially 2 years and beyond. It's quite hard to predict beyond 2 years when it comes to AI, right? What do you see as the future for AI? Where is it going to be used? Where is it going to have value?
2 years. Cool. I think let me give you 3 answers now. One, where were we 2 years ago? Whenever I speak to people I manage and lead, it's like, if you're going to say in 2 years' time, this is where your performance is going to be, where were you 2 years ago? And it's at a curve. Am I seeing this hockey stick which suddenly goes like that? And what's the evidence it's going to be a hockey stick? I think the same with AI. Let's look at where we were 6 months ago with, for instance, using AI to find zero-day exploits for cyber defense. 6 months ago, failed to do so. Today, finding significant amount, Claude Mythos, all that side coming out and saying, here are vulnerabilities which have been detected very quickly at pace. The AI Security Institute study found that it is successfully penetrating, controlling enterprise network systems. Trial versions, which deliberately had flaws in them just before people start getting too worried, 3 times out of 10. But doing it what would take an expert 20 hours, doing it in 20 to 30 minutes. And so I think if you look at 6 months, that pace of change is so rapid. So much as I'm an evangelist and love predicting the future and telling you what 2035 is going to be like, I also caution people to say, whatever prediction we make for 2 years' time is going to be wrong. So start thinking about, how do you cope with change and the unexpected? Okay, and it goes back to mindset. How do we start thinking about that, rather than trying to predict the tool set we're going to be using and therefore saying, it's going to do this, how do I adapt and change to it? Adaptability and flexibility is far more certain than having fixed technology that's changing. So that's the first answer. Sorry, forgive me, but I'm going to answer 3 times.
Please.
The second time, I think that we're often going to see AI doing unexpected things. Now, we can argue that that's something that's going to create new jobs, new opportunities, new ways of thinking. But one thing we can be certain about is that we're going to be using AI in different ways. And yet, as we discussed, leaders are worried about the situation today. So I'd put that same question, where are we going to be in 2 years, to every leader you meet and everybody that the audience meets and say, what are we going to be like in 2 years' time? What does that mean? What does that go? What does that mean for me as an individual? I often talk about becoming more aware about what AI can do. I then start asking people to consider day-to-day activities. Do they see that being used with AI? And then become more engaged. We need to have more of a conversation, not just us, but everybody, about where are we taking AI and what do we want it to do? And now allow that 2-year question to be answered much more comfortably, because the whole of society will be answering it, rather than people who are really interested and talk far too much about it. And then the third bit, which I'd answer, is I think that AI in 2 years' time is probably going to be on the verge of, I don't believe in artificial general intelligence. I think that is possible. It's probably going to be invented. But AI in 2 years' time is probably going to be doing things which are significantly harming society if we don't have that debate I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
So being able to predict it is hard. What I will say is that if we don't start thinking, how do we control it? How do we manage it? How do we make sure that people using it have my trust as a member of the public that they're using it safely, responsibly, with assurance? If we don't have that debate, then it will be doing things that are harmful and people will just be waking up and looking at them. When I was working in Microsoft a decade ago, our biggest concern was that we created the equivalent of a stock market crash in 2007. And suddenly it became, we are making decisions which make that possible. Not inevitable, but possible. And so that third bit is, in 2 years' time, AI could do really bad things if we don't start thinking about it today and doing something about it.
So the lesson here is be aware, be prepared, have the conversation now rather than have it forced on you in the future.
Get engaged. Understand what it could do for you. Understand how it could impact you. Talk about it.
So this video series is, of course, called AI Changes Everything. With that in mind, is there anything that AI doesn't change or shouldn't change? Obviously, you've spoken a little bit about the preparation in 2 years, but is there anything that comes to mind immediately?
I'd be deeply concerned if we have another social media problem. I think that my children are old and in their 20s, but they grew up in a social media age. And I think today it's very popular and common for people to go, I didn't realize social media is doing such harm and it's so bad for people and we should ban it for 16-year-olds. And yet it was pretty obvious. We could see that. We could see that this was perhaps unhelpful. It wasn't encouraging people. And with hindsight, we should probably have done more about it. So one thing I hope it does change is we start thinking, how do I use AI safely?
Yes.
How do my children use AI safely? And I think the second thing that it won't change is human ingenuity. I think it'll enhance it. I think it'll definitely, in parts, replace it. It'll start giving ideas, suggestions at a pace that humans go, it's so much better than having to get 20 people in a room and brainstorm something. But I still feel that many things will be resolved by human ingenuity, not by artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I genuinely hope that is the case, right? There is something to be said about the creativity of humans, right? And we must always preserve that.
AI prompt of the week.
Tony, I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, but before I let you go, one of the questions I always ask is, do you have a favorite prompt, like a prompt of the week that you encourage our listeners and viewers to use?
I do. Mm-hmm. It's quite long. It's about 20 lines long, but
okay.
I cut and paste it.
We can share it on screen, but can you describe
great.
it?
In which case, yeah. So I cut and paste it every Monday. It goes across all my emails, all my calendar appointments, and it very simply says, what have I missed that I shouldn't have missed? But to do that accurately, it needs a lot of detail and knowledge, but then it prioritizes it into, you need to do this now. You need to put some time aside to do this one. And this one you need to be aware of, and you probably need to go and speak to somebody about it. So that prompt has been essential for me I travel a lot. And so being able to put that in on a Monday morning and just say, what have I missed in the last week and prioritize it for me? Such a godsend.
That's a brilliant prompt. I'm going to use that one for sure. Excellent. As I said, thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you. We could go on for hours. Best of luck going forward. And thank you everyone for tuning in and watching. This is just one of the interviews in the AI Changes Everything video series. If you're interested in watching more, then I encourage you to go to oracle.com AI changes everything. Thanks once again, Tony, and thanks everyone for tuning in.